Hey, this is Andrew with Good Space. This video is really important if you're thinking of building a new home or doing a major retrofit or remodel to your home. It's about pre-construction services. Joined by Bronwyn Barry with Passive House BB. Thank you for coming.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So pre-construction collaboration, pre-construction services is about a team approach between client and design and construction. So Bronwyn, why don't you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So for my projects, working directly with a contractor in the design process is key. And I actually require all my clients to engage in a pre-construction services contract. I find it to be the most productive part of the process and essential to really making sure that a project has great outcome.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's something that's a bit newer, I guess, for some people in some residential projects. Commercial projects have been doing this for a long time because they've recognized the better outcomes. Bronwyn, what are the advantages or outcomes achieved by working with a contractor with pre-construction services and the collaboration at the early stages?
So there actually are a number of advantages, but the primary one that I always appreciate in that relationship with the contractor is cost optimization. Really understanding not just for the architect, but for the client, really getting that immediate, rule of thumb, usually at the beginning, like price comparison for doing one detail versus another, or one sort of product versus another. Because architects really, we can get a big picture, ballpark of costs, but we're not on the immediate front line of that in the way that contractors are. And, so it really keeps everything in check right from the get-go. And I really, material selection. So like having somebody on the team that I can say, okay, well, these are the products that I would like to use and that we're looking at. And then have the contractor go, okay, well, you go ahead and look at how available are they? And then, so supply chain feedback right at the get-go. So we don't go through the entire design and permitting process without that information. And then at the end, after you really vested in a product or a design, realizing like, oops, it's really expensive and it's hard to get.
Yeah. And we've seen that, right? Like, I'm sure a lot of people have seen that, experienced it, heard people have been through it. It's really tough that when something's designed that actually can't be built for whether it is material availability or cost. So even for us, it's challenging to keep up with costs, but we are able to do it iteratively in the pre-construction services process. So I also think it's very valuable because it is kind of heartbreaking when something's designed and it hasn't had that cost feedback loop along the way. Then constructability is another one, right? Like, can it actually fit and work, or how difficult is it to build it this way?
And that's huge, and that has an impact on cost, right? Like if you make it complicated or not something that local crews and trades are familiar with, it's going to have a massive cost impact. So front loading that information, that intelligence in the design process is huge, and it makes for a really seamless transition from the design part of the development to the construction, because the construction team has looked at the details and has had input on the details. I mean, I'm really grateful for, good contractors who can, I show them the detail and say, hey, this is sort of how I'm looking at putting this assembly together, what's the feedback?
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm sure you...
And it's quick feedback in the design process rather than the plans are done and then it's like, whoa, we need to pull this all the way back.
Absolutely.
And people are already enjoying their design and happy with the design. And then if we have to try and make changes later in the process, it's more painful.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And huge impact too for the structural engineering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that's another part where, you know, structural engineering can be done in multiple different ways. And if the contractor is on board in those meetings or sees, you know, I always ask my structural engineers for a draft set, and we have that meeting. We sit down and we go, okay, you know, do you want structural, you know, like regular lumber on this, or do you want LVLs or TJIs? You can go a bunch of different directions. And if the contractor is the one that knows, you know, in this market, that product is this cost versus that cost, and we can have that discussion and, you know, really getting the team integrated and marrying all the trades and the professions up front in the design part is key. And it's, again,
I have a good story about that. We've had the experience of that structural. So we had a house addition. It kind of tore it back fairly far, so it took the roof system off. Ultimately, they were trying to, the architect wasn't using pre-construction services. It was a number of years ago. And the design got complicated. So the structural engineers doing their work and putting in a lot of beams, posts, footings became very complicated. And then we received a proof set of plans, and we were looking at it and pricing it. And then we said, well, can we just put trusses on this instead? And it was a $40,000 savings to get rid of all the complicated structural engineering, beams and posts. And the engineer was doing their job and kind of doing what was requested, but hadn't looked at it with a different lens. So that saved the client some money ultimately, but it slowed the project down too, because the plans were approved. And so from the building department, so we had to go back. Project stalled out. We were able to do a bit of foundation work, but stalled out while we were trying to get the change done because it was all re-engineered. So had there been some pre-construction services in the beginning, would have saved time and money there. So, and the time one's big too. Like the construction goes smoother if contractors and design team are involved from the beginning, because everyone's kind of on the same page of how it's being built, right?
Yeah, and I think it also is a great opportunity to really build trust with the team.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I always say to my clients, I require that we bring a contractor into the team at design phase. But I, you know, also let them know you're not married to that contractor if it's not a productive relationship, and I've yet to have an unproductive one. But it gives them the out, you know. It's also a great vetting process for like seeing, okay, how does this team work together? And, you know, is this a contractor that you want to build the project? Because it's not a given that if you do pre-construction services with one contractor that you have to hire them. But
that's big. I mean, agreed, nobody wants to be in a relationship that's not working, and building a new home or major project is quite a long-term and intense relationship for a while. You're making a lot of decisions together, and it's often your dream home, so it's important to have a good fit. So that is a good opportunity to learn more about the contractor that you might be working with. So,
no, good. And it's always a savings. You know, you're either going to pay for it like at the back end, or you're going to pay for it at the front end, and you're going to save a lot more money if you pay for it at the front end.
And ultimately get a better project, I think, too, right? It's designed better, with less compromises. One thing that I think is another good example is the space for equipment, mechanical equipment, equipment that the house needs. If that hasn't been designed in, and sometimes as contractors we know how much space we need for a duct run and things like that, and we can double check that is there Otherwise, a compromise is going to get made if it hasn't been designed properly. Bronwyn, we've been talking about the team approach. So what does a typical team look like? We understand there's the client and architect, contractor. Are there other pieces of the team, parts of the team?
Sure. There's always, other professionals involved, typically structural engineer, sometimes a civil engineer and a landscape designer, depending on the scope and extent of the project. But we also like to bring in like a passive house, certifier or passive house consultant. I often have done that role, played that role in a lot of my designs, but I, like to bring that person in now to serve in that capacity. And then we can also bring in thermal bridge consultants, somebody who will do the thermal bridge analysis, or an HVAC consultant, so somebody who's really specifically designing the mechanical systems.
Yeah,
So-
that's a really good point. A lot of people in construction would be familiar that commercial projects generally get designed, but the design on a lot of residential projects and mechanical is mostly non-existent. It's kind of, there's a placeholder there.
Or left to the subcontractor to just sort of do rule of thumb.
Yeah, and then if it's left for the subcontractor to decide, they're likely to install whatever's cheapest and easiest, not necessarily.
And,
the best.
oftentimes oversized, and not really like considering the passive house benefits of, smaller loads. But, it's like, there's also a challenge in terms of sometimes the smaller load equipment isn't really available. So there's,
So it's important. That's definitely a difference, right, with the
Absolutely.
passive house compared to conventional construction. I think pre-construction services works for all of them, but there's just one other piece that's very valuable, having the passive house designer, consultant, and mechanical.
absolutely.
Yeah, so do you want to sum up the final kind of expectations for the client of how the process would run?
Sure. So I think pre-construction services really bringing the contractor in. I bring them in at design development. So we'll have the schematic design and the basic direction kind of already blocked out.
So that's kind of the rooms, the spaces they want,
The
shape.
form, the overall. But once you start getting into the weeds of how the assembly is going to be put together, what are the materials, and how is the structural going to integrate with the architectural, essential to have a contractor on board at that stage.
Got it. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for joining us on this video, Bronwyn. And please watch some more of our videos, especially on the Sacramento Passive House that we're building, and you can get to watch the journey along the way and see how it all comes together. Thanks.
Thank you.